Dr. Healy is an internationally respected psychiatrist, pharmacologist, scientist, author, professor, and knows a lot more than we do. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Healy.
Can I just ask you guys to hand these out?
By the way, the materials that Keith referred to that were available, they're going to be available in the DVD that were CD that we talked about.
Yeah, if you email us, we will put it on Dropbox and give you an invitation to access the material. Yes, it's on the brochure.
Right. Wonderful. I've just handed out 2 handouts. One of them has 2 sides to it. It's got a bunch of slides on one side, and it's got a bunch of questions in essence on side 2. It's got page 1 and page 2. There's also one that's just got page 1, which has got a bunch of slides on it. If any of you don't work in law, you can make sure that you hand the one that's got the 2 sides to it to anyone who's working in law, because that's one which lawyers will need as opposed to those of you who aren't legal. Water, and when we're ready, it's up, is it? Everything's okay?
Yeah.
We're good. And you want me to start straight away?
Please.
Okay. Right, I'm going to give you a very different talk to the one you've heard from Keith. Keith, as the outline, is an expert on fairly high-powered ways to look at the data, the adverse event data that FDA has. And it's a wonderful resource to have in the cases that you may have. But while he can do wonderful things, you guys here in the room have the expertise to solve a problem that needs to be solved, that FDA can't solve, and Keith can't solve, and Bill can't solve, and I can't solve. We need your input. And what I'm going to try to do is try to explain to you just what the input needed is. You have the skills, not us. What I'm showing you here first is risk.org. I sound like I'm slightly faded in and out there. Okay. What you can see here is risk.org. Risk.org is a patient adverse event reporting website that, along with colleagues, I helped create. The first ideas for risk.org took shape 2.5 years ago in St. Louis, where I met Jerry Killian first, and Bill, Keith was there as well. And it was this idea that we need a place where people like you, if you're on a pill, can go and report an adverse event. But if you've got anyone, your wife, your husband, your children, anyone you know who's on a pill, any pill, it can be an antidepressant, it could be a drug used to lower your cholesterol levels, it could be a drug for arthritis. If there's an adverse event, and actually all of these drugs can cause you to become homicidal. If you're on these drugs and things are going wrong, we want you to go in to report to adverse events, to report the adverse events that you may be having on the pill. One of the useful things that make metadata is to generate good data that people like Keith can work with. But beyond that, it's generating data that we can give you and that we need your input on. One of the further things that's on the risk.org website here is down at the bottom of the page, we've got a media bar. And if you go into the media bar, you'll be able to get all of the slides from this talk. You'll be able to get the transcript of what I'm actually going to say. And hopefully in due course you'll have a video as well. You'll actually be able to see me give this talk to all of you. Okay? But what I'm concerned about first, before we go into the issue about can these drugs cause people to commit homicide, can they make people violent, I want to pick up the issue of adverse events on drugs. When I began medicine first, if things happen to you on the pill, as Keith has outlined, if you go on a pill, you become suicidal, or you get this, you turn blue, and you halt the pill, and you turn back pink again, and you go on the pill again, and you turn blue again. Everybody agreed that the pill, this was wonderful evidence that the pill caused the problem. Nowadays, if any of you go on a pill, and you turn blue, and the thing clears up when you hold the pill, and comes back when you get put on the pill again, people will say to you the pill did not cause it. And you need to understand, first of all, how we've moved from the way the world was once, where you could believe the evidence of your own eyes, to the way the world is now, where it's harder and harder to believe the evidence of your own eyes. And that's what you're up against, that's what we're up against, and you guys have the skills needed to turn that around and to persuade people that they need to be able to believe the evidence of their own eyes. Okay, first of all, I want to take you quickly, before we go into the issues of can these drugs cause people to become homicidal, I want to take you quickly through all of medicine in about 15 to 20 minutes. You need to get a history of the whole thing. It starts here 50 years ago. If you're a child back then, if you had a child back then, as you see in this advert for a drug here, might have gone to the medicine cupboard and fished out some pills that you left there. They were your sleeping pills. They were a barbiturate. And if your child had been able to open at the top, which didn't have child-proof tops back then, and accidentally overdosed on what looked like some sweets, they could have killed themselves on very, very few of these pills. And here's an advert for a new sleeping pill called Distavol. And the beauty of it, you're being told, is that if your child goes to the medicine cupboard and fishes out the bottle of pills and opens them up and swallows the entire thing, it'll be fine. There'll be absolutely no problem. Distavol is a huge step forward in terms of safety. Distavol was thalidomide. This is an advert for thalidomide. In the wake of the crisis that happened, we put some regulations in place to try and prevent it happening again. One of the things we put in place was randomized controlled trials. Companies were going to have to be able to show that their drugs worked and were safe before they'd be let bring the drug on the market. President Obama believes that this is the kind of thing that's keeping you and me safe. If we didn't have this, the world would be a lot less safe. This is the key safety step that was taken. The step was put in place in the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drugs Act by a man called Louis Lassagne. Louis Lassagne was the first professor of clinical pharmacology in the world. He was one of the creators of the controlled trial. He's the most famous researcher on placebo ever. He's got articles that are in Medicine's Hall of Fame, and they're all about the placebo. When doctors qualify, they take the Hippocratic Oath, which was written not by Hippocrates, but by Louis Lassagne, who took the older Greek version and rewrote it in a form that people can use now today. And this, of course, contains the famous aphorism of, first of all, do no harm. Why he introduced controlled trials into the FDA regulations was this. Back then as now, there was an appreciation that medicine, when it danced with the pharmaceutical industry, was dancing with a python. You've got to be terribly careful how you handle industry. So here's the oath Lou wrote that, as I said, most people here in the States, when they qualify, take this oath. And here's the problem that Lou is trying to cope with. In Malaysia, women, in particular, dance with pythons. It's an art form. It's easily done, okay? The key thing you've got to ensure, you have to avoid, is that the python cannot be let grip onto with its tail, grip onto anything fixed. Because if it can grip its tail onto anything fixed, it can then squeeze the dancer to death. This particular woman that you saw here made a mistake in the course of the dance later on and was squeezed to death. Lou made a comparable mistake that is squeezing you and me, not just as lawyers trying to defend people, but as citizens taking pills. It's squeezing us to death. He forced industry to prove their drugs worked through controlled trials, but industry realized they can do the trials and they can hide the data. They don't have to let anyone see what the data from these controlled trials actually has shown about what the pills do. Can it make you suicidal? Can it make you homicidal? And while they can hide that data, they have gripped our rock, which means they are squeezing you and me to death. The trials we do that should keep you safe are in fact putting you at risk, personal risk. Forget the patient that you're forget the clients you're trying to defend. Just as individuals, you are at risk. The situation is worse again. The controlled trials devalue the observations of doctors. 50 years ago, both doctors and pilots were seen as being both in the business of keeping you and me safe. When you take a flight from Chicago to Washington, the pilot, if things go wrong, she'll report a near miss, she'll report the adverse events that happen. She reports to a thing called ASRS, and her observations are paid heed to. The system changes if she or a number of people who are report the same thing. But if your doctor reports an adverse event, clinical trials these days have undercut her observations. They're regarded as anecdotal. They are thin. People like Keith have used wonderful methods to try and retrieve these observations. What we need to do is we need to be able to go beyond that and get to a world where, and this is where you guys play a huge role, get to a world where the observations of doctors are believed more in a way that the observations of pilots are believed. Of course, there's one big difference between doctors and pilots, which is if you're on board on a plane and a pilot is looking after your safety, she's actually looking after her own safety at the same time in a way that's not true with a doctor. If you go down, the doctor's fine. But there's a further, deeper problem again, which is this, that regulators and companies are constitutionally averse to saying a drug could cause a problem. In the case of thalidomide, the regulatory and company response was, we have no reason to believe that this drug has caused babies to be born limbless. It may, for example, have prevented spontaneous miscarriages so that children who were limbless, who would have previously been miscarried, are not being miscarried. How do you know it's actually caused the limblessness? And you may say that it's an extreme case, but in fact, that's not a picture from the 1960s. That's a picture from Brazil 10 years ago, where there are now between 1,000 and 2,000 babies who have been born this way as a result of their mothers taking thalidomide. And thalidomide is on the market here in the United States in several forms. It is not banned. Okay? But aside from that, you may think that's a unique case. I'm going to try and bring home to you the fact that it's not unique by telling you about the case of Matt Miller. Matt Miller was a 13-year-old boy who changed school. He moved from one school to a different school and was a little less happy, as you might expect, having changed school, not knowing the new kids there. He was a little anxious, a little tense, and the teachers recommended to his parents that he be taken to a doctor. The doctor said, oh, you're anxious, you're depressed, we're going to put you on Zoloft. He was put on Zoloft and became restless during the week that he was on Zoloft. And a week after he went on it, went into the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his bedroom and hung himself. Now, Zoloft caused him to commit suicide. But that wasn't the response from the company, wasn't the response from the regulators. The company response was that Zoloft quite possibly instead caused autoerotic asphyxiation in a 13-year-old boy, because he wasn't hanging with his feet completely off the ground. You may know that when you hang, so when people are thinking about hanging, when they're beginning to think that they might kill themselves, they test things out often. And if you put a rope around your neck, it presses the carotid bodies, and you're still standing on the ground when you're trying this out. If the rope presses the carotid bodies, you sink to the ground unconscious and strangled, and you look like you're hanging kneeling almost, which is what gave Pfizer the basis for saying this is autoerotic asphyxiation. And they went so far as to scrape the carpet for seminal stains. This is standard FDA and company practice. If you guys are waiting for FDA to say a drug has caused a problem, you might as well leave law, because they are never going to say it. You're going to have to find other ways to come up with causal statements. Aside from that, there's a further issue here. Now, this is in the handout. For those of you who got a handout with either 1 or 2 pages to it, the slides you're going to see now are on page 1, and they're there for you to read. I'm going to go through them too quickly for you to be able to read all of what's here, but it's there for you to read afterwards. What you've got here is a woman who's getting in touch with GSK. She lives in Michigan. She lives in a Christian community there, so what she goes through is a particular problem for her, which is this. She's had panic attacks. She's put on Paxil. It's helped her hugely. She's got married, she's got pregnant, and she's found in the course of the pregnancy that her baby has a condition called truncus arteriosus. She's told by her OBGYN, you have to terminate. And that's where her Christian background is a real problem. She ultimately terminates the pregnancy. She still wants to have children. She and her husband both want to have children. So she gets in touch with GSK and says, look, is there any evidence Paxil can cause birth defects? I need to know. If it can, I'll go off the pills. Okay? So the response from GSK to her is, no, actually this is part 2 of the email from her to GSK. Okay, she says, look, I'll go off the pills if I have to. I mean, your pill is great. I'm not blaming you. Your pill has really helped my nervous problems, but I really want to have a baby, and if need be, I will go off these pills. Please get in touch with me and let me know. GSK do get in touch with her. They send her back the patient information leaflet, which at the time says that absolutely there is no way Paxil can cause birth defects. They recommend to her that she should go and talk to her doctor. Doctors are at this stage being marketed to heavily by GSK, who are saying to them, far from Paxil causing birth defects, this is the antidepressant of choice for women of childbearing years. So they're being encouraged to put any woman of childbearing years who may be anyway nervous on Paxil. So this is what she gets back from GSK. So she gets in touch with them again and says, look, please, can you let me know, is there any research going on Paxil? I need to know. This is critical for me, okay? Now, one of the interesting things here is that she got an email through to GSK at all. This is quite extraordinary. If she tried to contact GSK, and this is true for most companies, GSK has many phone numbers. They have phone numbers on the bottom of their direct-to-consumer adverts. They've got phone numbers on the adverts for the drugs that go to doctors. They've got phone numbers on all kinds of things. None of them get through to the medical information department in GSK, period. And there's a further twist to this. That's the way things were then. The company looks like it's cleaned up its act. Now it's saying to you much more clearly, we want you, if you have an adverse event on a drug, to report to FDA, to the MedWatch scheme. We want you to go and talk to your doctor also, because he or she is the person who knows about your medical condition. But this is sublime. If you do get through to GSK, they have an obligation to follow you up and determine whether the drug caused the problem or not. They're going to keep in touch with you, follow you over time, and work out, did the drug cause the problem? They have to decide, they have to make a causal determination, did this drug cause the problem or not? FDA do not have to follow you over time. They do not follow you over time. So diverting you to FDA is a way for the company to save money. They employ less pharmacovigilance people. They reduce their legal liability in the process. And by getting you to report to FDA instead, they reduce the observations to the status of anecdotes. It's sublime. You couldn't, I mean, they must have had a bunch of lawyers. Now, I've told you this particular woman got through to GSK, so they have an obligation to follow her up. And here's the follow-up. They write out to her, okay? As it turns out, they write to a P.O. box, and we know she never got GSK's letter. They're asking her, they need the name of her OBGYN because they have to check with him, does he think the drug caused the problem or not? They don't get to check with them because she never got the letter, so she doesn't give them their name. Even so, without all of that, GSK have to look at whether the drug could have caused the problem or not. They've got to decide, is it unrelated, unlikely, possible, problem, probable, almost certain. And in this woman's case, despite not having got hold of her OBGYN, they have decided it's almost certain. The almost certain you see there is the determination on her case. It is almost certain their drug has caused the problem. Now, this is Jane Neiman from GSK, at the time was head of global safety. And Jane is being deposed in the Kilker case. And Jane is asked, okay, did GSK do the right thing not to tell this woman that their drug causes the problem? And Jane, who you see looks like an extraordinarily nice woman, really fine woman, says, no, we did exactly the right thing. We followed the law, the rules to the letter.
I just have to interrupt you before you say, I was at that deposition.
Okay.
I'm the one who found that report. And aside from what you see from her, the look on her attorney's face was like it was white. It was, and you won't see that on here.
But the next step is Jane's a medical doctor. And Jane is asked, okay, take off your GSK hat. As a medical doctor, do you think you did the right thing? And her response is, well, yes, as a doctor, I think we did the right thing. It's this woman's doctor who has to make the choice about what the next thing to do is. Then Jane is asked, take off your medical hat. You're a mother. As a mother, did you do the right thing? And she says, well, as a mother, I think we did the wrong thing. I think she should have been told what we knew. Now, mothers and doctors have no rights when it comes to adverse events, but as you may know, 2.5 years ago, the Supreme Court here decided that if you're an investor in GSK, you have a right to see the adverse event data, whether it's statistically significant or not, whether the proportional reporting rates are high or low or whatever. If you're going to put your money into this company, you have a right to see what the data looks like. Risk.org, which you've seen, is a way to try and solve the problem you've just seen there. If you're trying to solve problems, you can take a shower or a bidet approach, a top-down or a bottom-up approach. Lou Lasagna took the ultimate top-down approach. We want clinical trials. We're taking a bidet approach. We want you to report the adverse events that are happening. And that's what you see here. We want it because this is the FDA data, and you've heard from Keith, there's 4.5 million reports of adverse events that FDA hold. You can download these. There's all sorts of high-powered things that Keith does with them that we don't offer you the opportunity to do, but we make the entire data set available to you for free. We're going to construct a user interface, which means you can ask the kinds of questions you want to ask about this. You can go and get all of the data. But what we're hoping you'll do is get people to report to risk.org also for this reason. This is the Paxil data showing liver disorders, and you see there's much more problems happening over in Japan than anywhere else. Our belief is that in order to solve the problems about what's going on here, is Paxil causing liver problems, you've got to put the data in local hands. It's Japanese people who are going to work out why this is happening here and not elsewhere. In the case of other problems, if they're happening here in Chicago and not Detroit, we think it's you guys here in Chicago and the folk over in Detroit who are going to work out what are the differences between here and there that mean this drug is causing a particular problem here and not there. If you're waiting for the regulators or the company to solve whether a drug causes a problem or not, you'll be waiting forever. It's about putting local people in charge of the knowledge, and with the skills you have and the other people that go on these bills, you're the ones who are going to work out what's causing what. But here's a quick symbol before I go on to the next bit of the talk about the bit that you're really here for, which is this. Thalidomide led to randomized controlled trials being put in place. The extraordinary thing was that as of 1962, when controlled trials were built into the amendments to the 62 Food and Drugs Act by Lou Lasagna, only one drug had been put through a placebo-controlled trial before it was brought to the market. And this trial showed that this drug was extremely efficacious and safe, and this drug was thalidomide. And there's the article, and the person who ran the trial was Lou Lasagna. You cannot get a better symbol of what's wrong in medicine today than that. You cannot get a better symbol of the threat to your personal lives than that. You cannot get a better symbol of the legal problems you're up against trying to take an adverse event case, particularly in the area of homicide, than that. You see Dancing with Pythons here. It's not just industry pythons that you guys have to dance with. It's evidence-based medicine and controlled pythons as well. Okay, when it comes to homicide and violence and fraud on drugs, that's where the adverse event issues get most complex. They get most complex for a few different reasons. One is this. This is Stockholm syndrome. This department store in Stockholm was in 1973 a bank. The bank was raided. The people who took the bank staff hostage kept them there for 5 days. The police and the media camped outside. When the siege was broken and the hostages were let free, they came out blinking into the light of day, were interviewed by the media saying, what was it like to be in there? What did you think of these awful people who were holding you hostage? And the media were surprised when the people in the bank said, well, you know, we thought they were rather nice people. We kind of agree with their political aims. And this is where Stockholm syndrome was born. if you're isolated, if there's a threat to your life, and particularly if your captors are kind, you're likely to identify with the captor and not say things to them that are going to make them unhappy. If any of you are ill, you're isolated. There's a threat to your life. And particularly if the treatment you put on causes things to go wrong, there's an increasing threat to your life. And of course, your doctor these days, and you can only get the medicines because they're on prescription only, your doctor, your captor is increasingly trained to be nice, to say to you, have a nice day. It makes it harder and harder for you to let them know that there's an adverse event happening on the drug that you're on. There's another aspect to prescription-only status that will be of interest to those of you who watch Breaking Bad. I don't know how many of you do. This is wonderful. This is superb. This is the best thing on TV. It's all about methadone in the form of crystal meth. This is a drug that causes people to become sex addicts, crazed in all kinds of different ways. It's a drug that causes civilization to come to an end. Well, methadone was a drug that was on the market as an over-the-counter drug until it was replaced by SmithKline Beecham with dexedrine, which was a more potent and dangerous form of methadone, which again got controlled until recently brought back on the market as a treatment for ADHD, but it's given to kids and apparently has no side effects at all when it's on prescription only. On the streets, this is a dangerous controlled drug. On prescription only, it's got no side effects at all. And these drugs are pale shadows of a drug called ropinirole, which is a drug used for Parkinson's disease and restless legs syndrome. It's a dopamine agonist, which is a much more potent version of either crystal meth or dexedrine. It's given to high court judges and Supreme Court judges who've got Parkinson's disease, and it's led to notable cases of gambling addiction, sexual addiction, gay sex addiction, etc., etc. Okay, it's much worse than any of the others. But because it's available on prescription only, the side effects haven't been recognized. It takes, on average these days, 20 years from a prescription-only drug side effect being reported first to the field accepting that it happens. If it's on the street, everything, any hint that the drug may be causing a problem is instantly assumed to be good evidence the drug is in fact causing the problem. But if it's available on prescription only, no one wants to believe the evidence. In the case of drug-induced violence, there's a number of people who are groups, well-meaning groups, who are very anti the idea that this could be happening. I've approached ACLU to try and raise the issue that there's a lot of people in prison for homicide or violence who are there, who are innocent people. Their drug caused the problem. ACLU simply do not answer any queries. Their issue is treatment access. They only want to make sure that people in prison are getting access to treatment. They don't want to complicate the message by saying that these drugs, which some people in prison may need, could also be causing problems. In the same way, the Boston's Women Collaborative Group, who in the 1960s were the most radical group around the place, helping to empower women generally, these days don't want to hear that antidepressants might be causing birth defects, or miscarriages, or autism in children born to women who are on these drugs. They only want women to have access to treatment. There's a real access to treatment issue that seems to trump everything else. No one wants the message to be complicated. And of course, at the moment, in terms of homicide, the big issue is gun control. And the people who are interested in gun control don't want the message complicated by the idea that the pills may also be causing the problem. There's one further factor we have to take into account when you're going to see the cases that you're about to see now. I'm going to divert to issues that will be of much more interest to you, I think, which is this. Of course, we're going to deal with a bunch of cases where often it's the husband that murders the wife, okay? But of course, obviously the most common murder is a husband murdering his wife. The most common murder detected, that is, wives murdering husbands are probably the most common murder. But in the face of antidepressants causing people to become suicidal, one more group we need to take into account is this. The American Psychiatric Association issued this particular press release, which was, we believe that antidepressants save lives. They should have said that we believe that psychiatrists save lives, and that's the point I'm going to end on here. I want to take you first to this. This is the Yvonne Woodley case. Yvonne Woodley was a very balanced, very normal, middle-class, 42-year-old woman who ran into problems with her husband. That's her father you see there. She went along to her doctor, who said she's under stress. The notes clearly indicate she's no suicide risk at all. The doctor put her on Celexa. A week later, she goes back to the doctor. She's on an extremely low dose, goes back to the doctor, who reports she's become suicidal, but reports she has no suicide risk at all, and increases the dose. She makes an effort to kill herself. She goes back to the doctor, who again reports she's no suicide risk at all, and increases the dose. She hangs herself. Now, there's an inquest, and at the inquest, the doctor treating her, I'm going to see later, and I, and the medical director of Lundbeck, who make this drug in the UK, are asked the same question. And here's the medical director for Lundbeck being asked a question by the coroner, who's saying, look, I would like a yes or no answer to these two questions. Can your drug cause someone to commit suicide? And the answer from the medical director of the company is yes. And is that what you think happened to Yvonne Woodley? And the answer is no. Now, the important thing here is this. In the case of Lundbeck company being asked this question, they will usually divert the question to an academic. The professor of psychiatry in Rush, the professor of psychiatry in Harvard, the professor of psychiatry in whatever, and they are free to answer the question whatever way they want. They can say, absolutely not, there's no way this drug can cause a problem. Or else they'll answer the question of, do we think it caused Yvonne Woodley to commit suicide? In which case you can always answer the question, no. But if they get a bold question, it's important to ask the right question. If they get a bold question, can your drug cause someone to commit suicide? The medical director of the company has to legally say yes. And it may be the same for violence. I don't know. That hasn't been asked. I'm going to come back to this in a few points. How would a drug that causes people to commit suicide, the antidepressants all come with a black box warning at the moment that they cause people to commit suicide. Elsewhere in the world, they also come with warnings that they can cause people to be violent. They cause people to become violent in the same way that they cause people to commit suicide. There's three classic mechanisms. In fact, this moment I'm going to give you the three classic ones. One is they cause a problem called akathisia. And here are some great examples of what akathisia is. These people who have akathisia are put on a drug called reserpine. Now, the interesting thing about the descriptions you see here is that all the people being put on these drugs are being put on reserpine for hypertension. They have no mental health problems, no nervous problems. These are mentally normal people, and on this drug, after a few doses, often after a few hours, they become intensely suicidal and even homicidal. That's akathisia. Probably better described, it's an obscure word, and it's a much better bet to use words like mental turmoil or irritability or frenzy. The other thing that the drugs can do that's been well recognized, not by FDA, not by the company, but by cartoonists like Schultz in the Peanuts cartoons. And here's a Peanuts cartoon from about 15 years ago, which clearly recognizes the emotional disinhibition or emotional blunting that the SSRIs can cause. Lucy has pitched the ball from Charlie Brown. And for those of you who followed the cartoon series, you see that the response from Charlie Brown here is totally atypical. And Lucy is completely puzzled, as you see. But Lucy knows the answer. Lucy knows why Charlie Brown's behaving the way he is. And it's a Prozac-induced emotional numbing. Again, the drugs can numb you to the consequences of your actions. Things that would normally cause you to be all worked up and anxious and you wouldn't contemplate doing. On these drugs, you will contemplate doing. The normal fear response and things like that simply won't be there. This is a further cartoon to bring the point out, and I'll leave you guys there to read it. I don't have a cartoon for the third thing that the drugs can cause, which they can cause a delirium or frenzy or psychosis. On these drugs, you may hear the voice of God saying to you, to murder Keith Altman. Okay? If I hear what I believe to be the voice of God saying to murder Keith, well, I will murder Keith.
That must be my next slide, sorry.
Okay, fine, okay. So they're the mechanisms. We're going to pick up a few more elements to those shortly. But I want to take you to some key cases, and then we're going to be in the area of trying to get you guys to help the rest of us work out how to persuade a jury that the drug has indeed played a part. The history of all this really begins with the Westbecker case in 1989. It goes to court in 1994, but the events happened in 1989. Joseph Westbecker goes into his place of work, having been on Prozac for a month, with some AK-47s, kills 8 of the people that he works with, seriously injures 12 more before killing himself. The jury, in a 3-month case, ultimately come back with a verdict that exonerates Prozac, it seems, but in fact, the case had been settled before the final statements. The legal team for the plaintiffs arguably didn't put in quite the performance that they could have, and they certainly didn't raise a bunch of issues that they could have raised, and the judge got awfully concerned about this, and he took a further action which led to the verdict being vacated, and the case is now designated as settled rather than a verdict of validity.
Was the high-low?
Yeah, the high-low was the same.
Was the high-low? Okay.
I know.
The next case you need to know about is the Shell case. Don Shell was a 6-year-old man who had a history of fairly minor nervous problems. These states he ended up in lasted usually 2 or 3 weeks at most. 1984 was the first of them. He worked in the oil industry in Cheyenne. Well, he actually lived in North Wyoming and worked in the oil industry. So it's a place where tough people worked. In 1990, he was put on this new drug, Prozac, by his primary care doctor, who said, look, there's this great new drug out, and it really puts you right. He spent 3 weeks on it, during which time he began to hear voices, stopped the Prozac, and was told by his doctor, never take Prozac again. 1998, he had a further episode and went to see a different doctor who diagnosed him as having sleep problems. Not as being depressed, not as being anxious, diagnosed as having sleep problems, put him on Paxil. 48 hours later, Don Shell, whom you see here on the left, put 3 bullets through the head of his wife, 3 bullets through the head of his daughter, 3 bullets through the head of his granddaughter before shooting himself. Tim Tobin, whom you see there, who was his daughter's husband, took an action against GSK, and a jury in Wyoming returned a verdict blaming GSK for the deaths. In the week that happened, literally the week the verdict came in, a verdict came in Australia also on the Hawkins case. David Hawkins was a man with a history of nerves, but no violence whatsoever. When I say a history of nerves, I mean minor nervous problems. He had never been in hospital. He was being treated by a primary care doctor. At one point, soon after it came out, he was put on Zoloft. The doctor said, look, you've had an adverse response to the Zoloft, when after 2 or 3 days he came back and said he felt awful. And the notes record, this man should never be given Zoloft again. A few years later, he was seen by a locum doctor. His own doctor was away. There was a visiting doctor in there. So after he went to the locum doctor, who gave him Zoloft, who hadn't read the notes, hadn't seen the notes, saying, don't ever give this man Zoloft again. David Hawkins didn't know this was the same pill as before. He went home, took a pill, felt worse, took 4 more, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. And the following morning met his wife when she came down for breakfast and strangled her to death. Drove off to try and kill himself, but stopped on the way and called the police and turned himself in. The lawyer for the defense and the prosecution and the judge said, after a hearing which lasted hours only, that but for the fact this man was taking Zoloft, he would not have killed his wife. He walked out of court. Let me take you to a different Australian case, and this is the case of Marilee Bentley. This is a mother of 2. She had a history of being anxious. She hadn't had any pills. Her primary care doctor ultimately put her on Paxil. She did poorly on this. As the dose was put up, she did worse and worse. She was given Effexor instead. Started with a low dose. She had a poor response. The dose was put up. She was worse. Put up again and again. She was worse and worse. She was visibly agitated on the drug. She took her children for a drive in the car and fixed up a hose pipe to the exhaust and sat there and let the engine run. And after a while, the kids said, hey, Mum, we're feeling itchy. What are we doing? Stopping here. Why are we feeling itchy? So she decided this really wasn't working. She got off the hose pipe and drove off again. And a few miles up the road, tried the same thing again. And it didn't work. She didn't realize that her car had a catalytic converter and she could not poison herself and the children to death. She turned herself in. She was charged with murder. Well, attempted murder. The pills she was on were stopped, and when she was drug-free, it turned out she was very clear and very normal. She was a very different woman. The judge decided, but for the fact that this woman had been on these drugs, she would not have done what she did. This is the side effects case. For those of you who've seen the movie, you know that one of the people involved goes on a elixir, which apparently causes her to walk in her sleep, and while she walks in her sleep, she murders her husband. Well, MC was a 23-year-old man with a history of cocaine abuse. In order to try and manage the cocaine abuse, his doctor put him on Paxil and Zopiclone to help him sleep. It was clear the Paxil caused him to be agitated and he couldn't sleep. It stopped the cocaine abuse, but it caused him to be unable to sleep, hence the sleeping pill. It also caused him to drink. Over the course of the next year or two while he was on it, he began to drink heavier and heavier. We now know that SSRIs can cause a proportion of people to become alcoholic. They can cause alcoholism. They're good for some people who drink. They can also cause a proportion of people who haven't drunk at all before to become alcoholic. This led to a breakup between his partner and himself, but he had an arrangement that every so often, while he lived with his parents, he'd go back to her home because they had a child in common. He'd go back to her home and spend the night there. This particular evening, he'd gone to her home. They'd gone out for a drink. They came back from the drink. They'd had a quarrel, and she said to him, look, you're going to have to sleep on the sofa downstairs. So he did, and he took his Paxil and also the sleeping pill he was on. The next thing anyone knows is a few hours later, he arrives in the police station with the baby girl in his arms. He's covered in blood. The police don't know quite what's going on, and he isn't able to tell them what's going on. They go back to the house to check what's happened, and he's frenziedly stabbed his partner to death. He gets charged with homicide and convicted of murder, even though at the time of the offense, Paxil, which is the first of the two drugs he's been on, and Zopiclone, which is the other drug that he's been on, are the two top drugs reported to the regulator in Britain as causing sleepwalking, which should be the perfect defense against murder. These are the other drugs which, this is about 6 to 8 years ago now, which have been reported to the regulators causing people to walk in their sleep, mostly SSRIs, as you see, and drugs which cause severe nightmares. I mean, this is not just unpleasant dreams, these are violent dreams. Here's Jake Bennett. Jake Bennett's first wife had died. He married again. His new wife, was a younger woman. She was concerned that Jake was snoozy. He was almost infirm, not keeping up with her. And she was concerned that it was the pills he was on, the Librium and Doxepin, that were causing him to be oversedated. So she began emptying out the pills so that he was on less of a dose. Jake found out, went ballistic. They resolved the problem by going to a doctor who said, we can switch your antidepressant to Prozac. It's much less likely to make you sedated. Jake bought into this and went on Prozac. Over the course of the next 2 months, he continued to suspect his wife was interfering with his pills. In fact, probably the Prozac was making him increasingly paranoid. 2 months later, after his wife had reported to her friends, look, I'm getting more and more nervous being in the house with this man. He's becoming paranoid. He stabs her to death 200 times. Okay? He ends up being brought along to court, but being acquitted as not guilty by reason of insanity. He remains in jail in Mississippi, even though the condition has cleared up completely. Once the Prozac had stopped, the condition cleared up completely, but in Mississippi they are not prepared to discharge him from hospital. He remains in hospital to this day. This is the case of Leslie Demeniuk. Leslie was the mother of twin boys. She'd broken up with her partner. She diagnosed herself a few months later after the breakup as having panic attacks. She'd seen a direct-to-consumer advert on TV saying, if you're feeling anxious, you have this symptom and that symptom, you might have panic attacks. Zoloft or Paxil or whatever is the perfect pill for you. She goes along to the clinic where she sees a nurse, not a doctor. The nurse gives her Zoloft. Over the course of the next month, she becomes suicidal. She starts drinking more and more. We know that SSRIs cause alcoholism. She goes back to the nurse and says, look, I don't think these pills suit. She's encouraged to continue them. She goes back a few weeks later and says, look, these are definitely not suiting. The nurse says, fine, we'll stop them. We'll switch you to Paxil. And 48 hours later, she takes a gun and shoots the two twin boys to death. She tries to kill herself with a large overdose of pills. She ends up not killing herself, waking up to find the police there, is taken into custody and tried for murder, and remains in jail to this day. This is the Rule case. This is a man who was 72 at the time. His wife is there on the left, his daughter on the right. And he'd been married 50 years. No history of violence or nerves at all. He becomes anxious because of some unpaid bills and was very concerned about his pension plan. His wife says, you're okay. He goes along to the GP. He gets an SSRI, he gets Celexa. He has unusual side effects on it. We know he has it because he's a number of side effects that just aren't in the book, okay? But they are caused by the pill. He keeps a diary of the next 10 days that record himself getting more and more agitated and anxious, reporting fears that he may do awful things, reporting fears that he may kill himself, reporting fears that he's going to end up in a mental hospital. A man who has never been near a mental hospital in his life. On day 10, having been seen by his son the previous night, and the son sees a man he doesn't recognize, who's agitatedly pacing up and down, tearing his hair out. The next morning, after the son is gone, this man takes a mallet, a large hammer, and batters his wife to death. He turns himself in. Once he's off the SSRI he's been on, he's a completely different man. It's such a clear-cut case that I write a report saying this man is not guilty. He should walk out of court free today. But his lawyers betray him. They say he should go for a plea bargain. He'll only get 3 or 4 years in jail. Everything will be okay. They aren't okay. When this man comes out of jail, the small community in which he lives see a man who's a convicted killer. He had been a member of the golf club, the cricket club, the bowling club, the community up till then. The only people who will speak to him afterwards are the cashiers at the local supermarket. Okay? He's not out of jail, even though he's out of jail. And this is a Pittman case you've heard from Keith. There's Chris, there's grandfather. Christopher Pittman, who's 12 at the time, has an argument with his father in Florida. He leaves home and tries to make it to his grandparents who are in South Carolina. He spent half his life living with them. He's gone to school in Florida and South Carolina. He much prefers being with the grandparents. On the way, he's picked up by the police, who bring him into a child care unit. The child care unit say, this kid has no mental health problems whatsoever, but we're going to give him Paxil anyway. So they discharge him to the grandparents on Paxil. The grandparents take him to their doctor to get more Paxil. The doctor has no Paxil-free samples and gives him Zoloft instead. As you heard from Keith, over the course of a few weeks, he goes from a kid who's been in a school near the grandparents' house and got on hugely well, to a kid who's fighting on the school bus on the way to school, to a kid who's brought to church and cannot stay still in churches, kicking the bench in a way that's really getting in the way of anyone else being able to say the prayers and sing the hymns that they want to sing. So that the grandparents say to him, look, if this keeps up, we're going to have to send you back to your father. So after that threat, Chris takes a gun, takes the grandfather's gun in the middle of the night and shoots both the parents to death. Okay, he's tried as an adult, even though at the time of the crimes he's 12. This is the way it's reported by the newspapers. You see the tissues. He's there in court as a 15-year-old. You see the bunch of tissues. He's crying through most of this. Daniel Piper, the circuit court judge involved, looks at the issues and says there's no case in South Carolina that addresses involuntary intoxication by prescription drugs. Seems to turn the whole medical system on its head if you can't rely on the medication your doctor prescribes. Potentially forces you into a situation of lifetime commitment if that drug induces an effect of which you're unaware. There's something disconcerting about all this, Judge Piper says. Probably of a legal nature, but it's troubling me just what the issue is here. Well, what we're dealing with here clearly is the issue of an automatism, a drug-induced automatism, made more complicated by the fact that this is a prescription-only drug, and there's the issue of involuntary intoxication. These issues seem to me, and you guys will know much more about the law than I do, but they were raised and settled 350 years ago, roughly, by Lord Chief Justice Matthew Hale in the UK, and here's his book, and here's him. This book is used much more over the States, I believe, than in the UK. This is the British Lord Chief Justice, but the book has had much more currency over here than in the UK. And here's the key bit. You've got the bit the way it appears in the original book at the top. I've changed the way they used to do S's to the way we do S's now, and changed one more word so you'll be able to understand what's involved. Hale uses the word frenzy. The word we would use now is delirium. This is the insanity defense. If a person is delirious, they are not guilty. Now, the insanity defense has become complicated since by the McNaughton case and others, where as opposed to the man on the left here who's clearly frenzied and out of it and not responsible for his action, and lots of people, including the average person on the street, will buy that, the guy on the right was in a very clear frame of mind when he thought that the Prime Minister of England, William Peel, was trying to plot to kill him, so he quite coolly tried to kill Peel, but got the wrong person. He was operating under the influence of a delusional belief. This is a totally different state to the drug-induced states you've heard me talk about earlier, which are delirious states. And that's an issue that somehow we have got to get over, not just to juries, but to the wider public.
Doctor, I feel terrible, but we've got about 5 minutes before we're done in this room.
Okay, let me just move quickly. Let me give you the data and how it looks. Most of the data these days is ghost-written, but there's some Paxil data from the UK, which shows when they systematically follow people up on drugs like Paxil and Prozac, you can see that these drugs are linked to people becoming aggressive and violent. These are people who have mild problems. This is a document looking at the issue about articles being ghost-written. This is Zoloft trials, where the company has gone to ghost-writing agencies who have written the articles from the trials, and they're still waiting to work out what academic names they're going to put on the articles. Authored to be determined. The articles are written, they haven't worked out what academics are going to be put on it. But from that particular document, here are the Zoloft pediatric trials, and even though this is ghost-written, you can, and you know, the key data is probably hidden, you can still see that Zoloft is much more likely to cause children to become aggressive and violent than placebo. This is study 329 on Paxil, where GSK were charged with fraud by New York State because they so completely misrepresented the data in this pediatric trial that was done. As part of the settlement, GSK agreed to put their clinical trials up on the company website. They don't put all the trials up, and they certainly don't put all the data, but you can glean from what they did put up that this is what the data looks like. If you look at the hostile events, now hostile events include aggressive behavior, homicidal ideation, homicidal acts, and homicide, that there's a twofold increase in risk of people going on to a hostile act on Paxil compared to placebo. We have no reason to believe this isn't true for every single antidepressant that there is. They all carry black box warnings for suicide. Exactly the same mechanisms lead to hostility and violence. You saw the PMDD data there, that there's an infinitely increased risk in women going on into violent acts if they're taking Paxil for PMDD. Was a cartoon to bring out the point. But the more important data was the healthy volunteer data here. These are people who have had no nervous problems at all. They get put on Paxil, and as you see, they go on to become hostile. We did a healthy volunteer trial. Well, first of all, Pfizer did a healthy volunteer trial on Zoloft, and in this, women, 6 women taking Zoloft, 6 women taking placebo. The women taking Zoloft all dropped out after a week. Some of them, they were all agitated and anxious, and some of them were clearly indicating that they were having a aggressive pulse. Pfizer concluded Zoloft had caused this. Healthy volunteer data can be awfully helpful to you trying to work out what's actually caused by the drug, what's being caused by the illness. We ran a healthy volunteer trial of Zoloft also, and 2 of our healthy volunteer trials, two of our healthy volunteers became suicidal, and one of them became clearly aggressive and violent. Here she is. I mean, this is just an average, normal woman who became seriously aggressive taking Zoloft. How long has this been known? Well, this was a this was a meeting 50 years ago in Cambridge, UK, just after the first of the antidepressants were brought on the market. What you see here is the guys are saying that on imipramine, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibiting drug, we noticed that there's a group of patients who in the first few days of treatment become intensely anxious. They can not just become anxious, but end up having dreams and thoughts of aggressive content. This has been known for 50 years. It's not a recent thing, it's not a recent discovery. The American Psychiatric Association, with the issue about suicide and the antidepressants, grew up, said, we believe that antidepressants save lives. They should have said, we believe that psychiatrists can save lives. Richard, it's going to be 2 minutes. Relax, sit down. You're making me nervous. And it's also being recorded. Okay? Let me take you back to the Woodley case. We are just finished. The Woodley case. You saw the company director had said, our drug can cause people to commit suicide. The doctor who had treated the lady was sitting in the well of the court. She had heard him go on to say, if things go wrong, it's the doctor's fault. They've mishandled this. So the doctor is then asked by the coroner, do you think that this drug can cause people to commit suicide? And the doctor's response is, no, I don't. Doctors do not think these drugs can cause people to commit suicide, or homicide, or engage in fraud, or any other behaviors like that. Here's Aurora, Sandy Hook, VA Tech. The collage you see here could be switched around to the different school shootings. There is almost not a school shooting that has been recorded in which people have not been on one or other of the major psychotropic drugs. We can move around the collage so you see the doctor from each of the sequences there. This is the Aurora doctor you see here. Recently, a French psychiatrist, you may have been aware, was found guilty when her patient went on to murder. The court actually decided that she should have recognized the risks she posed. She was charged with culpability and found guilty by the jury. This caused a huge stir in medicine generally. The question is, what defense do doctors have? The problem of drug-induced homicide has been recognized for 50 years. The data is compelling. Just because you commit homicide and are on the drug doesn't mean the drug has caused it, but the fingerprint is quite clear. Keith has helped outline it. I've tried to add to it, and I'll answer further questions afterwards. We've created a violence zone on risk that you see here, and you see it here. We hope that you'll go into it. We hope you'll get people to report, because it's only if we get more reports of people going on drugs like the statins, which also cause violence, and a range of other drugs that we're going to be able to put each other in a position to handle these issues. I want to end with one last point. This is the last And this is where it really is going to take your skills. On page 2 of the handout, you've got a scenario outline, which is really based on this, and it's how would you persuade a jury to handle the Clancy case? Shane Clancy was a young man who broke up with his girlfriend. He left her. Short while afterwards, he actually decided he shouldn't have left her, but by this stage, she's found a new boyfriend. Okay? He's heartbroken. His mum sends him on a round-the-world trip. She does all kinds of things. When these things don't shake him out of it, she takes him along to the doctor, who puts him on Celexa. He gets a number of problems that are not in the leaflet as the things that the pill can cause. He undoubtedly is on the pills. He tries to commit suicide on the pills. He's brought by his mum back to the doctor, who says, continue these meds. He then goes late one night to the house that his girlfriend's new boyfriend lives in. She's there also. He kills the boyfriend. He tries to kill the girlfriend. He tries to kill the girlfriend's brother before impaling himself on a set of knives, having tried to stab himself to death 23 times. This is a frenzied state. A jury of farmers and business people in rural Ireland look at the case and say, it is not possible to return a guilty verdict, a suicide verdict. We have to return an open verdict. The drugs may have played a part in this. The other family, the Creaney family, cannot accept this. Now, what we're asking people to accept or buy into is the idea of letting the perpetrator of murder essentially walk free. It's a hard act. But we're in a world where we pay great attention to the rights of victims these days, but a world in which the victims of Sandy Hook or Aurora Tech are potentially the people who are going to victimize someone else. As a family of a person who appears to be the perpetrator, but isn't. They also are a victim. These are victims' families also, if the drug has played a part. You guys have the skills. I mean, it's going to need an extraordinary job to try and bring that kind of family round, and you're the people with the skills, not Pete or Bill or me. It needs your input. So we're going to adjourn to a room upstairs, and I hope you can give us some ideas.